In this episode, we're going to be discussing podcasting. For our first attempt at podcasting, we're going to look at a program called Audacity. Audacity is a free program available on both the Macs and PCs, so it is cross-platform. With it being free, it does not offer all the bells and whistles that some other programs, for example like Acid or GarageBand, may offer. It does purely what it says it does. It's purely an audio recorder, and that's it. It does not record or deal with MIDI, nor does it deal with video at all. It is only to record audio. So, if you're going to create an audio podcast, this is a perfect application for you to get started with. Being that it's free, you can try it out and see how you like it. Going up to our Audacity menu here, pulling down Preferences, the first thing you want to check is where your audio is coming from. So you click on Devices, and your recording device, in this case, is going to be my built-in microphone, as my H2 Zoom is currently being used by Camtasia, which is recording this video. So I don't want to double up and use the same microphone in two applications. That might cause problems. So in this case, I'm using my built-in microphone. Your device output, again in this case, is my built-in output, what's coming through my speakers. If I had a dedicated output or some sort of sound box that I could come out from, then I would possibly choose that if I wanted to. In this case, we'll just keep it with the built-in audio. That would also be appropriate if you were to plug in headphones and just use a set of headphones to monitor your audio output as well, also to prevent feedback. So we'll go ahead. You don't have to worry about anything else over there, unless you want to delve into some more of the more difficult parts or set your own various settings. Everything else, pretty much the way it comes, is standard. You should not have to play with anything in there. Just double check your microphone to make sure that it's the right one so you can start recording. So we're going to click OK there. Alright. You notice we have internal microphone all set up there. And now as soon as you click the record button, you'll notice we don't have any tracks down here yet. You can go up to tracks and add a new track. In this case, as soon as you hit record, a track pops up automatically and will start recording you. As you can see from my levels right here, it's recording my voice and picking me up quite clearly. And everything just keeps on recording. When I want to stop, press the yellow button, and it stops the recording. Once the recording is done, my levels don't move over there anymore either. So let's move down here and pull our slider back. As you can see, we have our little sound wave generated by our voice. What it was picked up is now a graphical representation. Just on the side for Macintosh users, as I'm recording this on a Mac, because Audacity is free, it doesn't have a lot of bells and whistles, as I said before. One of the things that it does not like to work with is two-finger keystrokes on your touchpad. So for example, if I want to move this back and forth, I cannot use two fingers on the touchpad. It does not recognize it. I have to actually go down to the bar and slide it across, or use my arrows. It does not recognize my two-finger touch as Safari and Firefox and things like that does. If you want to move up or down or left or right, you can just use two fingers and scroll. This does not function in that manner. Okay, so we can pull our title back there, click the button, and there it goes. Now if you notice, it's green. Let me stop that again. So when it's green, this level is moving, so you can see what's being played back. There it goes again. As opposed to when you're recording, which is red, these levels are playing back. So now for all intents and purposes, I have my podcast. I just did my podcast on whatever I want to. I recorded an audio track. If I want to record another audio track, all I have to do is simply click on the record button again, and this gives me a completely separate audio track than the first one. If you'll notice, my new audio track has its levels right here, as everything's being recorded. Meanwhile, my previous audio track is being played through. I'm going to press the stop button to stop that from recording. And I'll slide this back here again. Okay. Now, what I would suggest if you, for example, made a mistake, you got all this recording done, and you realized that you wanted to chop something somewhere, all you have to do is highlight that section, as I'm doing on the second track, and then when you press the delete key, it goes away. It's that simple. Okay? Also, there is a section here somewhere, which I can't... Oh, there we go. Where you would want to delete something. So you can simply highlight it. And if you wanted to use a menu, pull up delete, and it's gone. Or you can just use the delete key, the backspace key on a PC, and that will delete your audio track there. Likewise, Command Z, or go up to the edit and hit undo, will pop it back up just as well. Okay, basic editing functions, and there you go. So we have our first audio file created. Very basic, very simple. If you want another track, click the record button and you'll get a third track. You could also go up to tracks and pull down add new, and you want a stereo track, and there's your track. Now if you notice, this window opened much larger than that window did. We can just grab it down here and shrink it up a little bit. There you go. Okay, now we're going to save that file. Go up to File, pull down Save Project. This saves the file itself. Now I'm going to open this here in the desktop, and we're going to go into Podcast 1. And I'm going to call it Pod 1, and we're going to save. Okay, podcast has been created. The file has been saved. Now we want to create an audio file from this mess up here that we have. We have two distinct audio files. When we do export, and in this case I'm going to save it as an MP3, as that's what our audio files are set for podcasting. pod1.mp3. Again, being a free program, it doesn't have all of the auto-fill-in features too. So when you select MP3, you have to actually type .mp3 in order for it to recognize it. If you change any of these other file types, you'll notice that my file type up in the bar there is not changing. If you don't put .mp3, you'll get an error message when you go to save, and you can fill in your various MP3 tags in there if you want. And it will say your tracks will mix down, so no matter how many tracks you have, they'll get mixed down to simply 2 stereo channels. And there it goes. Sometimes there is a pop-up that will come up that would say that some programs will have a problem playing MP3 files. However, I think I possibly disabled that, so it didn't come up. If it does, you can cancel, go back, and just add .mp3 to your audio file. Now we're done with Audacity. We can go up to Audacity and pull down Quit. And if we look at our desktop and our podcast folder, and here's podcast right there on the desktop, so I'll throw that into the podcast folder. Okay, and we're going to click close on that. Now, what differentiates a podcast from a simple audio file is the wrapper that it's placed in, which basically it comes with an XML file. The XML file tells a little bit of data about the MP3 file, about the podcast itself, and also will allow what's called podcast aggregators. For example, iTunes is an aggregator, and there's a number of free aggregators, as well as your web browsers have built-in aggregators that will search these podcasts that you subscribe to. It looks at the RSS feed and sees if anything has been changed or updated, if there's a new episode. And if there's a new episode, then you have a choice of what you want to do. Some aggregators you can set up so that it will download the podcast automatically. The problem with that is you could end up with literally hundreds or thousands of podcasts, depending on how many you subscribe to, that are not listened to because of just your own schedule and whatnot. So I tend to shy away from the automatic subscribe feature and just download everything that comes down the way. In this case, though, this is what we're using this program called Podcast Assistant. We're going to actually create the XML file for that podcast. Podcast Assistant is a free program. Again, it's running on my Mac. If you go to download.com and search for podcast or podcast makers, RSS feed, anything that has to deal with that, you can find a bunch of free programs. Or also cheap programs, shareware that you might have to, or donationware that you might have to pay a couple dollars for, that will create the XML feed for you. The problem, if you don't have one of those, is that you have to create the XML feed yourself. That can become a little tedious. Now, it's not so bad after you create the first one to look at the model if you understand the HTML language and go back in and create your own, or to adapt it for a new feed. However, if you can use a program like this, it makes things a whole lot easier for the XML file. So let's click on Create. we're starting a new podcast. And we're going to click continue. Okay, and my title is going to be Pod 1. And you can fill this all in here as to whatever you want to distinguish. Links if you want to put a link to your web page. Long strings if you want to add a longer file description. Owner is going to be me. And simply hit continue. And it says, where am I going to save this? I'm going to save this on the desktop. And it's going to go into Podcast 1. That's where it's going to save. Okay. And that's that. Now, add an episode. Now we have to tell information about the specific episode. So this will be first podcast. And subject will be how to podcast with Audacity. Author is simply me. Is it explicit? No. There is no... This is where you can fill in, for example, if you have an adult podcast, you would want to say, yes, perhaps, if you use explicit language that children should not be listened to. If it's a podcast that is acceptable for children and there's no worry about the language at all, then you can click on clean. All right. File size, duration. This is information. Again, you don't have to fill in necessarily all the information. But the more information you fill in, the better it helps the aggregators to find out and report that information to the user. All right, so now in this case, I'm going to hit continue. And my changes have been saved. What do you want to do? Okay, I don't want to add another podcast or another episode because I don't have one. We're going to quit. So I'm going to hit continue. And there we go. And now my feed, Pod 1, if I open it up, you can see all the XML that's put in it. Okay, and that essentially is how you create your podcast. And there you go. Now, there are a couple things that we did leave blank. For example, right here it says iTunes image. This would be where the image is hosted on your website. The link would be where your podcast, your MP3 file, is hosted on the website. In this case, since we don't have any, this is not put on a website. It's just sitting in my folder. I didn't go through that. But you can basically see how everything is laid out from here and play around with it a little bit. It's not something that's very difficult, but it will take some time to go through until you understand the process and what takes place. I'm going to close my window there, and I'm going to open up my hard drive and my applications folder, and you can see a couple more podcast programs in here. There's a Podcast Maker, Podcaster, and Podcast Gen. Podcast Gen is actually a PHP file that will run and ask you for data about your podcast. You can throw it in, and it will create a feed for you. Being that it's not an actual application and it's a PHP file, I tend to shy away from that because that is a little bit more in-depth and a little more confusing than if you were to use an actual application like Podcaster or Podcast Maker or the Podcast Assistant, which we just use now. And so there you go. There's a very basic intro to how you podcast using Audacity. Thank you.